Alright guys, today I thought I would talk you through some of the snakes that we have here and tell you a little bit about them and some of the really cool characteristics that snakes possess. We'll start with this colourful guy. So this here is a corn snake. It's one of the most common snakes in captivity in the UK. Now, corn snakes originally come from the United States and they're a type of rat snake. Now, they're called rat snakes because they primarily prey upon rodents, so whether that's rats, mice, any other similar species. So they're a brilliant pest control agent if you think about it. So they get their common name of corn snake because they will typically be found in and around corn plantations, corn fields and everything like that in the United States. But they do have a wide range of habitats that they can live within. So grassland, forest, they can also be partially urbanised. If you look closely at this guy, every now and again you will see him flick out his tongue. Snakes have a very well developed organ in the top of their mouth. It's called the vomeronasal organ or the Jacobson's organ, and this allows them to essentially taste the air or smell with their tongues. So one of the reasons that snakes are forever sticking out their tongue is it's a really good way for them to be able to learn a little bit about the world around them. Snake eyesight is not particularly good. Snakes are thought to have evolved from a lizard-like ancestor millions of years ago that had originally gone underground and in doing so had lost its legs. Because obviously underground legs can be a bit of a hindrance, whereas if you're really long, skinny like a worm, you can pass through the soil and everything pretty easily. So that is one of the ways in which it is thought or hypothesised that snakes evolved from a lizard-like ancestor. Now obviously, living underground, eyesight probably not the best of your senses to be used most of the time. Now after the original snake ancestor evolved underground in what we would call a fossorial environment, so being based underground, also known as subterranean, after that snake species evolved, it came above ground and diversified into the multitude of species that we see today. Now, because this snake ancestor had never really had particularly good eyesight because it had been living underground, all snakes today don't have particularly good eyesight, so their sense of smell or taste is really exceptional. It's fantastic, in fact. And one of the reasons that snakes have a forked tongue is if, for example, the snake is searching for prey. So in the case of a rat snake like our corn snake here, it might be looking for a tasty rodent to eat. What it can do when it's trying to find out where that prey might be is it can stick out its tongue, pull the tongue back into its mouth, and when it does so it wipes it against the Jacobson's organ, and then it can literally tell from there if there's more rat particles on the left or the right fork of the tongue. So it's incredibly sensitive. Alright, so now you've seen the corn snake, I thought I'd bring out one of our other snakes. Now, this guy here is a Kenyan Sand Boa. So rather than coming from the United States, he comes from, you guessed it, Kenya. And you can see that this Kenyan Sand Boa, he's a lot smaller than the corn snake. Now, this is a fully grown adult. This isn't a baby or anything like that, so already you should be getting an indication of the huge diversity in sizes that you can get snakes in. Now this guy, our Kenyan Sand Boa, he's a fantastic little snake. He's really good for holding if you're someone who's quite tentative around snakes. And certainly ophidiophobia, so a phobia of snakes, is a very common phobia. It's right up there with arachnophobia. In fact, a lot of people have this kind of innate fear of snakes. Now, certainly if you are scared of snakes, if you do have ophidiophobia, then I would say this is probably the least scary of all of the snakes that I work with. Now, really similar to the corn snake, if you have a look here, you can see that he's continuously flickering out his tongue. So he's tasting the air, he's smelling me, he's just getting familiar with his environment. Because again, very similar to the corn snake and very similar to most snakes in general, his eyesight is very poor. And this is a species that is also fossorial or subterranean, so he'll typically want to bury himself. He doesn't just lay around out in the open. He's obviously quite a small snake. Many other species would try and eat him. So he wants to stay nice and hidden, and for the most part, he will bury himself just under the surface. Now, if you look on the side of his head there, you're not really going to be able to see any ear openings. The reason for that is because snakes, in fact, do not have an outer ear. So you'll never be able to see any pinna, any external ear structures, even any holes in the head in the same way as you do sometimes see the holes in the head that are the ears in lizards. Now, these guys are essentially deaf to sounds transmitted through the air. However, when they are on a solid surface and when I'm holding him here, he will be able to detect the vibrations that are travelling through my body as I speak and as I hold him. So they are aware of vibrations, which is handy for us because it means if you're ever out and about walking and you don't want to encounter a snake, typically it will be able to sense you coming because it will feel those vibrations long before you get to the snake. That gives it a perfect amount of time to be able to slither away and get out of your way. Alright, so moving on from the Kenyan Sand Boa to another larger snake, roughly about the same size as the corn snake. This is a Colombian Rainbow Boa, and they're called Rainbow Boas because you might struggle to see it on the camera there, but if I get him in just about the right light, then he's got this kind of shiny iridescence. It looks a little bit like spilt petrol. Changing continents again, this guy, being from Colombia, comes from the continent of South America. So, being a boa, this guy is also a constrictor, and basically, a constrictor is a snake that kills its prey via a process known as constriction. Now, constriction, lots of people think that if a snake constricts its prey, what it does is it literally uses its strength to crush the prey to death, to break all its bones and kill it that way. That is not in fact what a constrictor will do in order to kill its prey. So they will wrap around their prey, but rather than physically crushing it to death, what they do is they just squeeze it really, really tightly. Now, when they've got the prey squeezed really, really tightly, and normally this prey will be a small mammal, so a rodent, that has quite a fast respiratory rate, so it will breathe quite rapidly. What the snake does is it basically just waits for its prey to breathe out. When the prey breathes out, obviously its lungs empty, and when the prey breathes out, what the snake will do is it will tighten its grip ever so slightly. Now what this does is it makes it really, really hard for the prey to be able to breathe in, or if it can breathe in, it certainly won't be able to get as big a breath as it did before it exhaled. So what snakes do is they just bide their time, and every time the prey breathes out, they will squeeze a little tighter until the prey effectively suffocates or asphyxiates, so basically lack of oxygen, lack of air, and that's how constriction works. Now, even though he's wrapped around my arm at the minute, he's not actually constricting me, he's just using his tail as what is known as an anchor point. So he's wrapping the lower half of his body and his tail around my arm, just to give him the peace of mind that he's secure and he's not going to drop. Now, we're back to North America with this species. This snake here is a western hognose snake. And she's a little bit narky with me because I've woke her up from a nice sleep that she was in. So you can see her hissing there. Now, the hissing, I don't need to be nervous about anything. Hognose snakes are pretty infamous for hissing quite readily, and it's a scare tactic to try and scare me away. If she ever does strike, it's basically what we would call a bluff strike, so it's where they're kind of poking at you rather than going with their mouth wide open. Hognose snakes are another incredible species of snake because they have a very, very primitive venom gland. It's called a divernoid gland. In fact, it's so primitive that some people don't class it as a venom gland at all, but just a really, really specialised salivary gland. These snakes are what we call rear-fanged snakes. So what that means is their venom delivery apparatus, or in the case of this one, their divernoid gland delivery apparatus, is the fangs right at the back of their mouth, whereas front-fanged snakes have venom delivery fangs right at the front of their mouth, and that's a much more efficient way of being able to deliver venom to a predator or potential prey. Now, many snakes are pretty famous for hissing, and you've already seen from her that she will hiss if she wants to be put down. Now, how they make the hissing noise is by expelling air really, really fast from an apparatus called a glottis, which is basically the very, very top of their windpipe. So by breathing out really, really fast, what this does is it creates this kind of rasping noise as the air passes through the glottis, as it passes through the end of the windpipe. And that rasping noise is what we hear and interpret as a snake's hiss. If we move down the snake even more, then eventually you will get to a scale which is completely bright yellow, there's no black on it. Now this scale here is called the anal scale, and that is basically the scale that is covering up the cloaca. Now the cloaca is where these guys poo and wee from, and also where eggs come out. So they only have one exit hole, as I like to call it, and that is the cloaca. And you can find it on this girl by looking for her bright yellow scale. If we look again at the belly scales, the ventral scales, you will see they're all nice and shiny, and only one scale goes across the whole width of the belly, so they're only one scale wide. When you get to the anal scale, the bright yellow one, after that you might just be able to see there that basically the scales split and they become 2 scales wide as opposed to 1 scale wide. So those are called the subcaudal scales, and they denote the presence of the tail. So lots of people think that snakes are all tail, and I don't blame you because they haven't got any arms or legs, so you have all reason to believe that they are all tail. However, one way you can tell this is if I was to take an x-ray of this girl, you would see that she has a rib cage all the way down here, and the rib cage only stops when you get to the anal scale. So there we go, hopefully you've learned a little bit about the snake body plan. So we're changing continents again with this snake, so it's back to Africa. This is a royal python, and yeah, it comes from pretty much all over sub-Saharan Africa. And one of their other common names, as well as royal python, is the bull python, and you can kind of see why they get one of those common names here. Royal pythons, being constrictors, are very, very heavily built, and you can see he's quite broad, he's quite chunky, and he's very, very muscular, and that is because they need all of that muscle in order to constrict their prey. Now, in order to locate that prey, as well as using the sense of smell, royal pythons are also able to find their prey using essentially heat vision, which is pretty awesome. Now, if I show you his face, if you can see there on his face, he has a load of what look like holes just around his mouth. Now, those aren't nostrils, those are what are known as labial pits, and they're heat sensitive pits. Now, obviously that's a pretty awesome sense to have, especially when for the most part you are hunting endothermic, so warm-blooded prey. So what that means is, though this guy is ectothermic, so he's cold-blooded, any of his warm-blooded endothermic prey will essentially appear a lot warmer generally than the rest of the environment that he'll be able to sense with those labial pits. Alright, so now on to one of my favourite snakes, and we're jumping back to the continent of North America for this one. This here is a Hughlin milk snake, and you can see she's absolutely beautifully coloured in these bands of black, red and yellow. Now, milk snakes are a type of colubrids, so colubrids are essentially a group of snakes that are more recently evolved than boas and pythons. One of the coolest things about milk snakes is their coloration. So as well as looking beautiful, there's a reason for those vibrant colours. Now, milk snakes in their native range also overlap with the range of a species of highly venomous snake called coral snake. Coral snakes look really, really similar to these guys. And the milk snake is able to use this venomous lookalike to its advantage. Animals that have evolved to live with the coral snake will have naturally evolved to recognise that its coloration means stay away, I'm venomous. Now, the milk snake can use that to its advantage because by looking very, very similar to a coral snake but not possessing any venom at all, what that can do is any potential predators that would normally try and eat this snake will take a look at it and they won't necessarily know if it's going to be a venomous coral snake or a harmless milk snake. So if in doubt, if you're a predator, you're not going to want to eat it, you're going to stay away. So that just means this guy has an increased chance of surviving. This type of similar coloration is known as Batasian mimicry. You get two types of mimicry. The first type is Batasian mimicry, and as seen with the milk snake in relation to the coral snake, that is where a harmless species mimics a harmful species in order to gain some kind of survival advantage. The other kind of mimicry out there is called malaria mimicry, and that is where harmful species mimic one another because it enables animals to more easily evolve to recognise that that coloration is always harmful no matter what species it comes from. So an example of malaria mimicry would be like the coloration of a bee and a wasp. So bee and a wasp, both banded in yellow and black, both can sting you, both hurt. Now we can move on to my favourite of all of our snakes, and also the largest snake that that we have here at the animal unit. The sunset boas are a hybrid of boa constrictors, which are pretty famous. Obviously, lots of people know about boa constrictors, and they're a hybrid between a boa constrictor and a much smaller boa called a hog island boa. Now, hog island boas get a lot smaller than boa constrictors, which is why, even though this guy is pretty large, he's not quite as big as boa constrictors that you can see in the zoos, which will typically get anything up to about 13 foot. So one of the reasons that boa constrictors and hog island boas were first hybridised is because of this beautiful coloration they give off. Now, one of the things I can talk about while I'm holding this guy is the various modes of locomotion that snakes have. Now, the first form of snake locomotion, and the one that is probably most familiar to all of us, is that classic kind of side-to-side movement. That is what's known as lateral undulation. So that's only one of the ways that snakes can move. As well as that, there's something called concertina locomotion, and that's what they will typically use to climb trees. Now that is where the snake will literally wrap around the trunk of the tree, and it will move one coil up at any one time, loosening the other coils and climbing that way. Essentially it would be the same as me kind of hugging a pole and moving my arms up like that, and that is concertina locomotion. A certain few species of snakes do something called sidewinding. Now, sidewinding initially can look a little bit like lateral undulations. The only difference is, instead of the whole body of the snake touching the ground as it moves from side to side, it will essentially put a series of pressure points on each of the bands as it curves around, and it will lift the rest of its body off of the ground. So that is sidewinding. And another form of locomotion that snakes do, which this guy's kind of demonstrating here, is something called rectilinear locomotion. Now, rectilinear locomotion is where the snake will move in a straight line, and it will do that by moving all of the muscles in its ventral scales, almost as if it's doing a mini Mexican wave. While I'm at it, actually, I can show you how to use the snake hook. Hey, there we go, much better. So what I'm going to do is I'll pop this guy on the ground here, and I will show you how you can pick a snake up using this. Snake hooks are normally only used, or typically used, with either highly aggressive snakes or venomous snakes. So using a snake hook allows you to pick the snake up safely at no injury to the snake, while also keeping yourself completely safe. With a snake hook, you never want to be reaching over the snake. And the reason for that is because then the snake is essentially closer to you and the snake hook has lost its purpose. And you want to be essentially using the hook with the pointy bit sticking away from you, not coming towards you. You want to be able to put it about a quarter to a third of the way down the snake. The reason you're not aiming for the halfway point is because if you stick the hook under the halfway point, by the time you've picked the snake up, the chances are it will have moved over that halfway point, it will overbalance and it will fall off the other side. So you want to tickle the hook under the snake, about the first quarter, as you can see I've done here, first quarter to first third, and then by then you'll be able to lift the snake up. Now as you do that, this snake is going to reach a point of balance, and he's going to be able to self-balance himself, and that is what I call the teeter point. Now what you want to do then, because you don't want the snake dangling for excessive amounts of time on a really, really thin hook. So as soon as you've been able to pick the snake up comfortably with the hook, and you're keeping the bitey part, the head away from you, you can then proceed to pick up the tail end, keeping the head safely away from you, and from there you can maneuver the snake where you want. Now, if you were dealing with a venomous snake in the wild, you'd want to be a specially trained person anyway, and typically, as well as a snake hook, you would also have a bag with which to, as soon as you've got the snake, pop it in the bag, it's safe, you're safe, job done. And that is essentially a beginner class in how to use a snake hook. I know, you were very well behaved, well done.